first evidence on an impact evaluation we've done on an agricultural extension program in Malawi. This work is joint with Hope Michelson at University of Illinois. It's quite preliminary, so all your feedback and comments are really most welcome. As most of you guys know, the goal of agricultural extension is really to relieve the information constraints of farmers, right? With the hope that they will adopt new improved technologies, hopefully thereby increasing their yields and increasing their incomes. Now, this is especially important in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where really a large part of the population is dependent on agriculture. For instance, in our case in Malawi, where we work, 70% of the population depends on agriculture for their livelihoods. So probably because of this importance, and also of course because to a certain degree information is really a public good, right? You can't necessarily exclude people from information. The government has really taken an important role up of kind of doing these type of extension services for farmers. However, this role of the government has been changing. For instance, there's been a study by Krishnan and Patnam in Ethiopia where they look at the diffusion of hybrid seeds, and they noticed that at the beginning of the diffusion process, it was mostly the government agents who were considered to be quite important, while towards the end of the diffusion process, it was mostly the private agencies, so the private input dealers that were quite important. Now, when we look at the government programs and we look at their effectiveness, what strikes you, there's been many, many different studies. As you can imagine, most of these countries have these extension services. There have been a ton of studies on these. The first thing that strikes you is just the variability of these things. You look at effectiveness, this ranges from not effective at all. In fact, this was a money sinker. I mean, you're just wasting your money, to really being very effective. This is a huge amount of variability. I've picked out two examples, which are kind of a very recent ongoing studies. One example of Christian et al. Done by a team at the World Bank, who are currently evaluating a program in which they try to give tailored information about specific irrigation needs of crops, and they're not finding much of an average effect to date. Then there's been another study also very recently done, still ongoing, by Dylan et al. And they're essentially looking at the effect of providing farmers with a phone book in Tanzania. And this phone book has information about where dealers are located, etc. And this program is finding a very large effect. So basically we see quite a bit of variability. And it might be because of this perceived variability and maybe this perceived lack of effectiveness that governments have started to move a little bit away from extensions, and donors have started to move away, and essentially the money available for extension has been on the decline, and as such many extension services have been forced to reform. And this is where we kind of are starting up. We're starting thinking about, okay, if you're going to reform these extension services, how should you think about restructuring these services so that you're going to have an effect on farmers' learning? And this is where we pick it up. And so we're going to use a learning perspective for this. Now, before we do so, let me take one step back. Now, this figure should be probably familiar to the majority of, let me see whether I can point at it. This comes out of the famous book of Rogers, which is Diffusion of Innovations. So what this figure is plotting, essentially, it tells you what happens when you introduce a new agricultural technology in a population. So what this figure is showing here on the x-axis, this is time, and this is the percentage of adopters, and you kind of see this pattern here. So what you're seeing is a very complex pattern, right? You see early adopters, then some folks here adopting somewhat later, then here's some late adopters, and probably a subset of people never adopting the new technology at all. So this figure is kind of pointing already to the potential role of information constraints, right? So these first adopters here, maybe the kind of risk-loving people, they kind of go ahead with this new technologies they've only heard once from somebody, they're going ahead. Then these people here, they're waiting a bit. In the Indian context, they could be waiting for the experience of the progressive farmers. Once they have seen their experience, they will go ahead and this middle range starts to adopt. And these kind of, I don't want to call them laggards, but they're slower than the others, they're kind of wanting to wait until while all the progressive farmers have adopted, maybe a whole bunch of mid-range farmers have adopted, they've seen a lot of experiences, and then they are going to adopt. So we know already a fair bit about how kind of farmers learn about this technology. We know that they learn from experimentation. We know that they learn from each other. In fact, the majority of the literature has focused on this kind of social learning process. What we know relatively less about is these farmers here at the beginning here. How do these first farmers pick up this piece of information, and how do we learn from experts, kind of the start of this adoption process. And this is what we are going to study. So going back to our initial question, we have, so how do we structure these extension services? The first thing, of course, to note is that there are so many different models of extension services. So you're kind of comparing apples to oranges, right? The most famous one is called the training and visit system, in which an extension worker would go to a lead farmer in a community, share the new technologies, and then kind of hoping that this lead farmer shares whatever they have learned with their community. It's a very common standard model. There's a demonstration plot model in which you would set up a demonstration plot in a village, and a group of farmers would work together throughout the growing season, kind of trying out these different technologies. This could be under the guidance of an extension agent, and then kind of they're working together on this. Very common also are farmer field days, in which at the end of a growing season, you would invite a whole bunch of farmers, this could be thousands of farmers, to a particular location, kind of showcasing them, this is the type of yield we can achieve, and then talking through the various technologies that were used. Now, these different models, of course, have different implications in terms of farmers' learning. So the first thing, of course, something that we all know is that the returns to agricultural technologies very much depend on the circumstances, right? They depend on your climate. Rainfall, for instance, is a major variable, and they depend on your soils. So what does this mean? So for instance, I have one picture though that I wanted to add here. I picked this, I'm a big fan of soils myself. And so I picked this picture from the FAO database. These are soils in India. And so this one is called the fertisol, and this one is called an acrisol. Now, those of you who have a vegetable garden yourself will know that this one is probably high in clay, and of course requires maybe some lightening up, right? It might require methods to improve its structure, maybe adding some organic matter. You might have to be careful about using heavy machinery on this type of soil. This type of soil is more of a sandy type. You can see already it seems quite leached in the sense that there's the amount of nutrients can be quite low. So this kind of soil will need a fair amount of fertilizers, both inorganic and inorganic fertilizers, to make it work, even though the structure all in all is actually not too bad. So what does this mean essentially? It means that the recommendations for this soil would be quite different compared to the recommendations for this soil over here, and farmers are very much acutely aware of this. So this also means that if you have an extension project and you're showing them how particular technologies work within their village on a local demonstration plot, they will consider this relevant and might learn more from it. If you show them the same technology on a plot further away in different growing conditions, this might be less relevant to them and they might not learn as much. So this is the first point. The second point is that the type of agricultural technologies we're introducing these days are often fairly complex technologies and can really be seen really more as basket of technologies rather than just one technologies. A good example is our NGO with whom we're working, I'll come back to this later, is trying to introduce soybean farming in Malawi. So I looked up together with them, we looked at, okay, what is the optimal way of cultivating soybean in Malawi? And you have this brochure, you can download this online, you can look at it yourself. It's about 50, 60 pages of details on how to get basically the best yields of soybean that you can possibly get. So this is very detailed information. Essentially, you're asking the farmer to adjust their inputs among many different dimensions to get really this optimal profit. And this might be cognitively quite demanding. So what this means for our extension services is that extension services which recognize this and make it easier for people to learn will be met with probably higher success, and also extension services which somehow motivate farmers more so that they'll essentially incur the cost to do this learning will also be more likely to be successful. Okay, so what are we going to do in this project? We're going to look at two well-known extension models, demonstration plots and farmer field days, and we're going to look at their effectiveness, basically give the causal impact on farmers' learning in particular. Before I tell you a little bit more about the methodology, let me take a step back and tell you a little bit more about the ISFM technologies that we're studying. So this is a basket of technologies. It's not necessarily just one technology. It's a basket of technologies that essentially is aiming to increase both the short-term and long-term fertility of soils, and as a result also really increases long-term yields of soils. It includes quite a number of different technologies. It starts, for instance, with particular planting practices. These pictures were taken at our demonstration plot sites in Malawi. So you see these farmers here already outlaying the plot in particular ways. You see these lines here. So they're spacing the plants in an optimal way. Essentially, these ridges are going to be located on an optimal distance, and the plants will also be spaced in an optimal distance. So this is where it starts. Then they also think about ways of fertilizing the plants. They will use organic fertilizers in combination with inorganic fertilizers. One of the techniques that they're promoting is, for instance, fertilizer trees. An example is over here, which will increase the nitrogen content in the soils. Then it ends also with optimal kind of harvesting practices. After you harvest, you would keep the soil residues and leave them essentially on the land to maintain soil moisture. So essentially it's a basket of really practices, not just one practice, that kind of together would increase the fertility of soils. Now, why is this important in sub-Saharan Africa? This is important because soil fertility has been quite low in the last 10 to 20 years. Now, mind you, this figure is a bit outdated, but it looks quite similar today. But if you see here, you look at it, so soil fertility is not just low, but it's even further declining these days. Over here is Malawi, this little kind of red sliver over here, and you see it's in the worst case kind of scenarios here with an animal depletion rate which is among the highest in the continent here. So we know that these soil fertility problems are really substantial in this continent. We also know that ISFM can really help. It's been shown by agronomists that these techniques can be really matter and can be successful. However, the adoption remains fairly low. So clearly we're getting something we're not getting right. So the goal is for us now really to look at what is the role really of these information constraints in this particular process. Now, when we're going to evaluate this program, we'll have to deal with a couple of empirical challenges, which are typical for evaluating really any type of agricultural extension program. The first challenge is, of course, that when you kind of have an agricultural extension service, typically the type of region that would receive the service might not be representative, perhaps. Maybe they might be the better regions in the better agroeconomic zones. Or even the type of farmers that show interest in this type of services. These might be the better educated farmers, maybe the more patient farmers, the farmers that are more keen to learn. So we have to deal with this kind of omitted variable bias, which is there in all of the agricultural projects. Then a second thing we have to deal with, and this is particular for agricultural extension, is that our main outcome variable of interest is farmers learning. But a lot of the surveys don't really have any explicit information about what they've learned, right? They would have information about yields and income, very fuzzy measures, and they might have information about adoption. But there's a lot that can stand in the way between learning and adoption. I mean, markets are in the way, right? You might have learned something, wanting to adopt it, but for any type of market reason, maybe you're credit constrained or you can't find a product that you really want to use, you're failing to adopt, essentially. So what we really want to focus on is the learning aspect. So how are we going to do this? We're going to kind of combine, I don't want to say it's not a full randomized control trial, but it's a partial randomized control trial with multiple rounds of data collection. The rest of the presentation is fairly standard, so let's not wait too long here. Okay, so this is the context in which we're working. We're working together with an NGO, the Clinton Development Initiative. Now, this NGO is active in East Africa and in central Malawi, where we are working. Essentially, their main goal is really to improve the income of smallholder farmers through the adoption of these integrated soil fertility management techniques. So together with them, we essentially picked two sub-districts. I don't know whether you can see them over here. Wait, where is Lilongwe? So there it is. So we picked a sub-district here in the district of Kasungu, which is somewhere here in central Malawi, and then here in Doa, which is a little bit more south. And the characteristics that these sub-districts had is that our NGO hadn't worked in these areas before. They're kind of blank slates for them, right? So they hadn't been there before. in this particular location. We selected together with them 250 villages. These were randomly selected from all the villages there, and actually this is almost a census of all the villages, because there were only about 300 villages in those two sub-districts together. So we have pretty much almost all the villages there. So we selected the 250 villages, and we then kind of randomly divided these into a treatment and in a control group. So 125 into treatment, 125 in a control group. Now, the 125 villages in the treatment group, they were introduced to CDI's extension program, and the villages in that group were asked to form farmers' clubs. And these farmer clubs were then invited to farmer field days. Now, unlike the farmer field days, we also had demonstration plots, but these were not randomized, these demonstration plots. So we've only had 17 sites of demonstration plots, and these were in strategically selected villages. We'll have to deal with this strategic selection later on in the empirical section. But essentially, bottom line is that everybody in the treatment villages received the farmer field days, but only a subset of those in the treatment villages also received the demonstration plots. So this is how it was set up. A little bit more information about the demonstration plots. So we see here a farmer club setting up one of the demonstration plots. CDI focused on maize, which was the main cash crop in the area, but also the main staple crop in the area, but also three cash crops: soy, groundnut, and common beans. The plot was set up in a central location in the village on a good quality field, and kind of the farmers worked together as a group on this plot, guided by an extension agent. This is a very standard model, in fact. I mean, when demonstration plots are set up, this is usually the way how it's been set up, and which is, of course, one of the appeals of our evaluation, that we're evaluating something which is really fairly common. For the farmer field days, this is a picture of one of the farmer field days. As you can see, there were a whole lot of people surrounding a particular plot. There could be up to 1,000 farmers attending these at any point in time, these farmer field days. These were done at the end of the growing season, so maybe a couple of weeks before harvesting. It was a one-day event. Farmers were invited to attend. Transportation was provided to go there, and they essentially received information on the spot about the different technologies that were used to achieve the yields that they could witness. So this is how the farmer field days were done. Now, what did we do on our end in terms of data collection? So we collected a baseline survey before any of the CDI's projects happened. So we went into all of our 250 villages in the sample and essentially selected 10 households per village. Mind you, these are not like the Indian villages. So the African villages are actually much smaller. So they can have, typically an average would be 50, 60 households per village. So we selected 10 out of this household. In the control villages, these would be randomly selected from a census we created ourselves. In the treatment villages, this would be stratified. We would have 5 club members and 5 members just from the village, but who didn't belong to the CDI Farmers Club. The idea is, of course, that we later on can look at spillovers as well. At midline, we went back, but we only went back to 100 villages, and then the end line has yet to be done. The end line is going to be done next year, where we will be going back to all 250 villages. Now, for the baseline, we collected information on the village. We collected traditional household survey, agricultural input-output survey, but we also collected a bit of agronomic variables. So, for instance, we collected variables on climate, on rainfall in particular, and a subset of the farmers were selected for soil samples as well. At midline, we went back with a household survey. And then in addition to these kind of more quantitative and agronomic data collections, we also had a qualitative data collection round. We went to the villages 3 times. Okay, so the qualitative data collection consists of 2 types of activities. One was focus group interviews with 10 selected groups of farmers. And the other activity was semi-structured interviews, essentially with extension agents, both government extension agents as well as extension agents of the NGO. Now let me focus on just some bits and pieces of the data collected, not everything, but the one that we will go into further in the presentation today. On the adoption data, We covered questions on adoption, both recall questions, what have you done in the last 5 years, as well as the last season, as well as projected, essentially what do you plan to use the next growing season. And we tried to be as comprehensive as possible, trying to cover all of the ISFM technologies that were going to be introduced by the NGO that we were working with. In terms of knowledge data, this was really set up a way like you would test a student, right? This was 20 questions covering all the crops, maize, the main staple crop, soy, common beans, and groundnut, the 3 cash crops we were looking at. And we asked both general questions like what are the benefits of growing soy, as well as very specific question, what type of pesticides would you need for this disease? How much exactly should you be using? How far should these plants be from one another? So we try to have kind of a balance between general questions and specific questions, and as well as numeric questions, as well as multiple choice questions, and also between technologies that were more information intensive, technologies that were more credit intensive, and technologies that were more labor intensive. So we try to find the balance there in the 20 questions that we asked. In terms of village data, this data will come back later. We have quite basic information about the position of the village. So we went to each village with a GPS. We have the exact location of the village center, and we also know the location of the market, something that will be of use later on. We have basic information about the census of the village, right? Demographic information, number of men, women, children, ethnic distribution, and also kind of a bit of the history of the village in terms of past extension activities, what type of organizations that have been active in the village. Okay, so moving on, I'm not going to spend too much time on the descriptive statistics of our sample. I mean, you can, of course, compare this a little bit with the Indian setting. The majority of our household heads are male, which is probably pretty much consistent with the Indian setting as well. Age is middle-aged, average household head is 40. Education level is not too bad. It's actually better than what we had expected. It's kind of a few years of education on average. Land in acres owned, we're looking at smallholder farms. Note this number is fairly large, but then look at the standard deviation on this. Actually, the median on this is quite low. We should probably report the median as well, because this tends to be driven quite a bit by outliers, and as well, such is not perhaps not very representative. This is quite interesting. So we asked the farmers also their opinion. How do they think about their own soil fertility, right? So when we ask that, in fact, a lot of farmers appears to be kind of quite aware of the fact that soil fertility can be poor and is declining. Look at this number over here. Most farmers kind of say that soil fertility is stagnating or declining. Now, you guys might remember that we've also tested the soils among a subset of farmers. So we tested the soils and looked at various attributes, and I'm reporting just one of them. We tested, for instance, the nutrient content of the various soils, and for 60% of the soils, they were officially deficient in all of the nutrients that plants need. So they were deficient in nitrogen, phosphorus, and kind of more than 3 elements that the plants need. So soil fertility is poor and declining, and farmers are aware of this, and this is consistent with what we're finding in our soil samples. What do farmers use? This is at baseline, thinking back of the last 5 years before baseline. What kind of technologies have they themselves tried out before the NGO came along? The first thing to note is that some of the technologies that the NGO promoting, the farmers have actually already tried. So for instance, a lot of the farmers have experience with soybean. A lot of the farmers have experience with crop rotation and intercropping. These are common technologies in these areas. A lot of farmers have experience with some form of organic fertilizers, manure to be quite popular. And a lot of farmers have kind of tried crop residue as well. Some technologies were not as popular at the time of baseline. So you see, for instance, planting fertilizer tree were not as common, using of compost, inoculating soybean. Most farmers had never even heard of this. And pesticides, herbicides, and some of these other kind of modern inputs are not quite as common. So before I'm now going to present the main result on knowledge, I want to show you something on adoption. So we have a panel data set on adoption. So let's start looking at that, right? Let's look at before and after, baseline and midline, where in between the project was. And let's just look at how farmers who attended field days and how farmers who were part of this demonstration plot club, how they changed their adoption decision in the course of this 1 year. So we're going to use a simple panel data estimation for this first adoption regression. And what we're finding essentially is the following, is that when you look at the total adoption, we created here an adoption score essentially kind of out of the 13 techniques that we want them to adopt, kind of just putting binary variables, dummy variables, 1 if you adopt the technology and kind of creating the total score. We're seeing that attending the farmer field days does not increase your overall adoption score. I'll come back to the details later, but as a whole, it doesn't seem to affect your adoption. The demonstration plot club does increase your adoption score. The effect size of this is about 10%. Now let's look at some of the details. And what I did now here is that this is actually different from the paper I've put it in. I tried to put it in a graph instead. Now, my apologies for what is happening here. This happens over and over again. So somehow some of these numbers have disappeared, even though it just continues like this. This is 0.10, 0.5, so it kind of continues like this. So this is the effect of farmer field days on adoption for these different types of technologies. Now, here are the different technologies listed. Now, without even looking at the details, the first thing to note is that these are the average effects, the bars, and these are the standard deviations. The first thing you note is that these effects are not very large, right? Apart from this one thing here that seems to be even a negative effect. We have a negative effect on the adoption of soy. After you attend the field day, this is actually statistically significant. You're less likely to adopt soy even. We'll have to think about this a bit more carefully, but the positive effects are small and not surprisingly also when you look at the standard deviation are insignificant. In contrast, look at the demonstration plot farmers. You can see that some of these things are sticking out here. You have inoculation of soy is coming out, hybrid maize is statistically significant, and the use of fertilizer tree is statistically significant. So some technology seems to be standing out, and it seems that demonstration plot farmers are adopting them after this 1 year of experience. So does this mean, is this because the demonstration plot farmers have learned something and the field day participants have not learned something? For that, let's take a step back and essentially look at some of the qualitative evidence. So we've interviewed the farmers through focus group interviews every year. And so what came out of these interviews is when you asked the demonstration plot farmers, what have you learned? They would say things like, well, I've learned something about the expected yield. This is the yield we achieved, so I can have a sense of what the yield is that I can achieve on my plot. So they learned something about their own personal expected yield. When we asked them about the different technologies, they would say, well, we've learned about pesticides. And you would push them a bit further, and most farmers were able to say, well, we have used this pesticide or that pesticide, and this is how much we use it, and that's how you need to apply it. So they kind of knew the details of this as well. When you contrast this to field day participants, they also noted that they of course looked at the same crop, and they used the word impressed. This was the word that came out over and over again. We were impressed by the yields one could achieve. They didn't necessarily say anything about their own expectations. They said, well, look at this yield one can achieve, these big crops. And when we ask them more about the details of the production technologies, they tend to know less. They said, well, we know that modern inputs are clearly important, especially pesticides, but they were quite unsure about the type of pesticides being used, as well as the amounts of pesticides being used. Now, does that mean that the field day participants didn't learn anything at all? No, this is not quite correct either. Both sets of participants, in fact, emphasized to us that there was a great need for them to learn more about technologies which were in particularly labor intensive. So when we pushed the field day participants a little bit further on this, they said, for instance, well, they might not know exactly how much pesticide you need or what the type of pesticide is, but they've learned about two practices. They've learned about two practices came out in particular. They've learned about mulching. Now you guys might know the technique of mulching, right? The technique of mulching is essentially gathering kind of crop residues at the end of the season from different crops, kind of chopping them up in pieces and kind of working them in the soil. Or you can even, for instance, leave the crop residues temporarily on top of the soil. The idea is that you're improving soil structure, and if you leave it on top of the soil, you'll also improve moisture retention. So they've learned about this technique because, of course, drought is a severe problem in this area. So this is one technique a lot of the field day participants said they've picked up. Another technique they picked up was a technique of what is called for maize, one seed in one hole. So instead of the usual practice where you kind of go around and you put a couple of seeds in each planting station, you would go around and just pick one of it and put one in each planting station. This is more time intensive, but was considered useful and to be quite effective. So what we're seeing here essentially is the field day participant focused on particular components of their learning. So what our hypothesis then becomes is that, well, all of these farmers are facing a costly learning process, but their learning process is rational. So farmers will learn their expected yields if whatever they're seeing is relevant to them, which is probably what farmers who are participants in demonstration plots can learn more about the expected yields because it's in conditions that are similar to theirs. Farmers will also learn more if it's easier for them to learn. In the demonstration plot sites, they essentially are learning by doing, they're learning together, so it's easier for them to retain the information that they've learned. If we think about this in a two-stage process, imagine that you first learn about the expected yield, and then based on what you have learned about the expected yield, you decide whether or not you need to invest yourself into learning about the second day production process. What you could conclude is that the field day participants it's not necessarily a very good deal for them. So they are observing a new kind of crop, they're observing a yield, they might conclude that whatever they're seeing might not be entirely relevant to them, and because of that maybe already be a little bit less invested to learn about the details. On top of them, they're really constrained in terms of time. They have one day to learn about these different technologies. So what are they going to pick? They're going to pick the techniques that for them make sense from a cost-benefit point of view. And this is why we think we have so many field day participants focusing on the labor-intensive technologies, because most of them are credit constrained. Why bothering learning about pesticides when I only have one day, when effectively we'll probably never be able to afford pesticides anyway. They might not know exactly how much they cost, but they have an idea that they're quite costly. So let me focus on the one or the two things that I can take home and I can try at home. So let us then test this in basically the quantitative data. Now, to test this in the quantitative data, we have to deal with the fact that these demonstration plots were not positioned randomly. They were positioned in very particular locations, very particular villages where they were probably likely to be successful. And so the way we're going to deal with that is kind of a propensity score matching inspired approach, in which we first predict the probability that a village is going to be selected as a site for a demonstration plot. And then we're going to take this predicted probability and put it in our kind of our second stage regression here. So the P is over here. I don't have anything to write on over here, but let me try to talk through this. So essentially what we're then looking at over here is that T1 is the effect of the farmer field day. Now these were assigned randomly, so this is the alpha effect. Now for the effect of the demonstration plot, intuitively you can already think that this demonstration plot effect will depend really on the probability of your village of being selected as a demonstration plot site. You can imagine that there's some kind of a selection effect in that, which of course also means that when you're looking at the effect of demonstration plot, you will always have to say the effect of the demonstration plot conditional on which probability that you were selected. So I'm only going to present a subset of the results here. In particular, I'm going to present the results conditional on the probability equal to 0. You can also do the probability equal to 1, of course, and any probability in the middle. And I think this is a point that we'll have to work on a bit more. So let me show you some of the results. Now these are tiny, so let me talk through them. The first thing I'd like us to take away is we created a knowledge score in the same way as we created an adoption score, just kind of literally saying how many questions out of the 20 do you have correct. When we look at this knowledge score effect of the program on the farmer field days, we do not find a statistically significant effect. And it's not just that, the effect size estimated here is really small, right? In case of the demonstration plot crop, we find a very strong, statistically significant, and also important effect. This effect is 30%. So we find an important effect on knowledge. So we can document that the demonstration plot farmers have learned quite a bit about these technologies. Now, looking at some of these details here, And so what we did here is we just picked, we of course have 20 technologies, so I didn't want to show all of them, but we're just showing some for the purpose of our discussion today, is that let's look at these kind of technologies and look at what exactly are you learning of those 20 questions that we've asked. And does this learning depend on the degree to which you're credit constrained? And our hypothesis there was that you're more likely to learn about labor-intensive technologies when you're credit constrained, and basically the other way around as well. So if you're not credit constrained, you might be more open to learn about more credit-intensive technologies like urea or other pesticides or fertilizers. So we see, of course, not everything is here, but we see essentially that not everything is statistically significant, but the ones that are pointing in this direction. So we're pointing, for instance, that when you're credit constrained, you're more likely to learn about spacing of groundnuts. Now, we didn't ask, unfortunately, about spacing of maize, but my hunch is if we put this into N-line, we'll see a strong effect there as well. You're less likely to learn, if you're credit constrained, about the use of urea, which is a fairly expensive fertilizer in this particular case. And you're also less likely actually to learn about pesticides, even though we didn't indicate that over here. So to conclude, what do we have? So to conclude is that I think what we can quite safely say to date is that these extension tools are different from one another. Farmers learn differently from demonstration plots as they learn from farmer field days. Now, our recommendation would not be let's throw farmer field days, let's not do that anymore. I think actually on the contrary, because of course you have to think about the cost component of this as well, right? We've spoken about the benefits, but the cost of this. At the farmer field days, we can invite 1,000 farmers, 500 farmers at a time. Demonstration plot is essentially you have to guide a group of 20 farmers 1 year. I mean, the amount of investment in each activity is quite different. So we want to think about, okay, what does this mean? How can we make those farmer field days more effective? And there are a couple of ways of doing this. And in fact, I'm actually also happy to say there's a couple of new projects already ongoing right now that are trying some of these new technologies. So given that we're going to go ahead, we're still going to do farmer field days, how can we make these farmer field days more effective, given what we know so far about farmers learning? Well, the first thing is that, well, we're giving them a lot of information in one day. Most of these farmers might be illiterate. So what can we give them as tools that will help them learn so that if the day comes that they can actually apply these technologies, if they have credit, if they have things that they effectively can go back to whatever tools you've given them. There's a study I know by, I think, Duflo and her team on measuring spoons that is considered to be quite successful. Like instead of just giving them pesticides, give them a measuring spoon with the pesticide. How much exactly do you need to use? And this has been shown to be quite popular. You can use pamphlets. Another study of a team at Michigan State looks also at the effect of videos. Instead of just showing people the result of the crops and talking about them, make them sit in front of a video where actually the crop is shown throughout the cropping season, and particular things were shown like inoculation, not straightforward to do, but once you've seen it a couple of times, you can kind of do it. So showing it instead of maybe talking about it. So these things might already be quite effective. The second thing that we would conclude here is that the location of these farmer field days. It's no use having a farmer field day in a far-flung location which farmers just don't consider relevant to them, right? So in a way, you can have multiple farmer field days, but you want to match the participant with the exact farmer field day that matches their general agroeconomic conditions, similar soil, similar climate. So whatever they learn is relevant to them. In fact, one of the things that we didn't go into here, we would even encourage farmer field days in this regard compared to demonstration plots, because one danger of demonstration plots, and this is something we've seen in our villages, is that sometimes demonstration plots can fail, of course, right? When the rain is bad, the demonstration plot can fail, and then you want to be careful of not being stuck with the entire village as a kind of a non-adoption trap. They haven't learned anything, of course, from this failure. If anything, they've learned something negative, right? So in that sense, farmer field days might even be preferred to demonstration plots to a certain degree, that you avoid in this kind of a non-adoption trap where certain demonstration plots would fail. Then the last thing is that I think that might make sense to again think about recoupling these type of interventions. Agricultural extension in Africa was historically linked to input marketing. So essentially, historically, agricultural extension officer would go around, provide information, and at the same time also provide credit and telling people about where they can purchase the input and even bring the inputs along. This connection has been severed in the last couple of years, the last 10 years, and now it's only about providing information. There was a concern about incentives and bribing, etc. But I think from a theoretical point of view, somehow these things will have to be linked up again. Clearly, if even the learning is constrained by the marketing, what not will marketing then later on do for adoption as well? So clearly, marketing and learning cannot be seen separate from each other anymore. A small comment on extension via cell phones, which is now quite popular, and there's a lot of programs already worldwide, several of them have been evaluated, that it seems that using simple language, growing condition specific, and perhaps accompany them by credit and input market information. Several of the existing programs already do something like this. A last note on the limitations, and I go back to this picture over here, right? So what is our biggest limitation here is, of course, we've done a one-year evaluation, right? In the end, what you're interested in is that how this information diffuses through the population. What will matter is not just how these first people learn, but also who these people are, where they are situated in the network. Are these people who have learned in a position to adopt these technologies and then diffuse it themselves through their respective communities? And that's something we will be able to come back to later on in this project. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much.